Good afternoon. My name is Marika Cox-Mitchell, and I'm Director of Early Learning at the Bainham Family Foundation, here to welcome you to the release of the Unifying Framework for the Early Childhood Education Profession. The characteristics of every recognized profession include a protected name and identity, uniformity of practice within and across states and territories, standards and guidelines that are created and maintained by members of the profession, state boards that ensure that only individuals meeting the profession's standards are licensed to practice. In addition, professions that contribute directly to the public good, kind of like, early childhood educators, are in industries that receive federal and state funding to ensure that members of that profession have the resources and supports they need to be effective. But to achieve this coveted recognized status, a profession must roll up its sleeves and do its work. The profession must organize themselves and create some degree of coherence and accountability. The nursing profession, for example, did this in the late 1800s. We caught up a little bit. And when they did this, North Carolina became the first state to license nurses in 1901. And today, all states and territories have a board that licenses nurses. Equally, and I'll say most important, nurses receive far above minimum wage compensation. They have benefits, and they have public funding to ensure that they are prepared and retained to do the great work that they do. When the history of the early childhood education profession is written, that history will cite today, March 9th, 2020, as the day that members of the early childhood education profession presented its unifying framework of the profession. At the beginning of this process, many said that this would be impossible, that there was no way early childhood folks, as fragmented as we are, as somewhat territorial as we are, will organize and reach a consensus that benefits the whole and benefits young children. We don't do that in this view, folks said. Many also said that there will be no way national organizations, particularly the ones with national offices in Washington, D.C., will check their egos and flatten the hierarchy so that those who work daily to support young children and families can actually guide this work. But here we are. 3 years later, 8 long decision cycles later, 175 focus groups later, more than 10,000 comments later, the early childhood profession has proven that we've done our arduous work, and we're now prepared on this day to release the unifying framework for the early childhood education profession. Thank you. I'll now turn this over to Karen Ponder, the chairman of the task force.
Thank you, Marika. We appreciate you joining us today. And I know I speak on behalf of the entire task force and educators everywhere. And I say that we are all for your leadership in this initiative and this speak. We're grateful to you for everything you've done. And will do to fight for educators, for families, and for young children. Because children are why we're here today. They're why we work in early childhood education, whether we work with educators, directors, policymakers, faculty, or systems leaders. And let me tell you, I know because I've been each one of those at one time or another in my career. In fact, I've spent my life working on behalf of young children and families. And it's been my life's work to honor and respect them, to care for and educate them as individuals in their own right and as part of their families, cultures, and communities. In the course of this work, I have seen we all do that inequity and inequality in the society every day. Yet I also see, and we must never lose sight of the fact that a child's access to quality should not depend on where she lives or what child care setting his family chooses, or which politician sits in a government seat, or even how much money her family earns. That's why I saw from my beginning as a kindergarten teacher, while young children, all young children, need power to protect. It's because the evidence-based, research-proven truth is that all children in their families will benefit from being supported by an effective, diverse, equitable, early childhood education profession with educators who specialize knowledge, skills, competencies, and are valued and compensated for their highly skilled work. Let's stop and think a minute about the groups of people who are also prepared, qualified, and compensated. In the course of the power of the profession, we thought about and we talked with nurses and architects, electricians, and speech-language pathologists, because we have so much to learn from each of these professions, the ways in which they're organized, and the implications their professional journeys have for how we think about who we are in early childhood education and what we need to become. They were clear about the difficulty of their journeys, and indeed, I've been in this field too long to be anything but clear-eyed about the challenges ahead. Yet I know, too, that success is possible. We've seen it happen. See it where it's happening now. There are places
Okay, you want me to go? All right. Good afternoon. We will hopefully get Karen back. She has been a great contributor and leader in this project. So I was asked to say a few words for this momentous event, and I just want to introduce myself to those of you who don't know me. I'm a senior policy director at the Alliance for Early Success, which supported the Power of the Profession, the work to engage stake-level stakeholders over the past few years. But I'm also here wearing another hat. I was one of the members of the National Academy's committee that produced the Transforming the Workforce report. And in that role, I find it both gratifying and humbling, really, to see the impact that it's had in the early care and education field since it was released 5 years ago. There's a lot in that report, but if I have to summarize the almost 700-page publication into a few sentences, and I did that, I say that one of the main things the committee was trying to do was to hold up the disconnect between, on the one hand, the value that our society has increasingly placed in the first 5 years of children's lives, and on the other hand, the poor policies and working conditions that early childhood educators experience every day. And of course, we also wanted to offer a roadmap for how to resolve that disconnect. So one example of this disconnect in the report, the committee made the following observation about early childhood educators that I want to paraphrase for you briefly. We said that although they share the same objective to nurture young children and secure their future success, the various practitioners who contribute to the care and education of these children are not acknowledged by our public policies as a cohesive workforce, unified by a shared knowledge base and competencies needed to do their jobs well. Well, today, with the release of the Power to Profession Unifying Framework, the early child education profession comes to unified. They have come together to put a stake in the ground about who they are, what they're about, and what policies and supports are needed to finally fulfill the promise of early childhood education. In a few minutes, you'll hear from all 15 members of the task force. And when you do, I want you to remember that behind each speaker, there is an army of early child educators. They are infantile teachers, they're preschool teachers, Head Start teachers, early elementary educators, CDA credential holders, and I can go on. So the point is that this vision is not that of any one organization or any one sector of the field, it is from the profession. Before you hear about the details about what's in the framework, I'd like to offer 3 things I appreciate about it as someone who has been supporting this initiative from the sidelines. First, it's finally saying out loud things that I think it's been hard to say, whether to ourselves or to the policymakers and decision makers who have power over our field. We're finally saying things like, it is not in the best interest of children for people to become early child educators without professional preparation. It is not okay that early child educators get paid $10 an hour and that Black and brown educators are disproportionately represented in the lower end of that continuum. It is not okay that we increase requirements for degrees and credentials without adequate supports for current educators to attain those credentials, and without commensurate increase in compensation, and without strategies to protect racial diversity of the workforce. It is not okay for family childcare to be an afterthought. It is not okay to expect families and educators and providers to bear the brunt of the cost of improving program quality and advancing the profession. Early care and education is a public good, and solutions require public investment. I can go on, but I won't. The second thing I want to appreciate about this publication is that it elevates the voices of the educators in the process. I know it wasn't easy, and it hasn't always been perfect, but I know that the NAYC and the task force really constantly challenge each other to do better, to learn from the process, and make improvements along the way. And I know that that spirit of authentic engagement with the early child educators in policy and decision making is spreading across the field, including the organization I work for, the Alliance for Early Success. Our organization has taken steps in the past year to be more intentional about how to engage the voices and leadership of early childhood educators in our policy work in states. We haven't figured it out all yet, but we continue to challenge ourselves and the state and national partners in our network to do better on that front. And finally, as an organization that supports a variety of policy, advocacy, and research initiatives around the early childhood education profession in states, I believe this document is an incredible resource for anyone who wants to help advance the profession through state policy. In our network, there are so many states who are already working on policies related to higher education, compensation, diversity, and equity. This framework can be a blueprint for a statewide plan for transforming the workforce. It can also be the foundation of a policy agenda or model legislation for policymakers or advocates. So I want to thank you to the Power to the Profession Task Force for this important contribution to the field, and to NAYC for leading and staffing this initiative. But this is just the beginning. We all have a lot of work to do, and the Alliance is eager to be a part of this movement. And with that, I want to bring to the podium a friend and colleague, Rian Evans Alvin, CEO of NAYC, to kick off the presentation.
Good afternoon. It's terrific to be with all of you. It's such an honor and a privilege to be standing here today alongside my fellow task force members and before all of you. I want to get us started with a quote that reads, "A conceptual framework must achieve a balance between inclusivity and exclusivity. It must fully embrace the diversity of roles and levels of preparation required for professionals working with young children to provide high-quality services. It must also recognize that individuals enter the profession with diverse educational qualifications and experience and simultaneously set high standards for professional performance and distinguish the specialized skills and knowledge of the early childhood profession from those of other professions. Indeed, it is the responsibility of the early childhood profession to define how it uniquely differs from all other professions." These words are not from the Unifying Framework for the Early Childhood Education Profession that we released today. They were written nearly 30 years ago by Barbara Willer and Sue Bradecamp in the context of an NAEYC position statement adopted in 1993. Today, you'll hear from all 15 organizations represented on the Power to the Profession Task Force. As you listen, you'll know that each of us stands on the shoulders of those who came before. And also that today is a new and unprecedented day. Today is new because of the widespread and high-level conversations happening about significant investments in childcare, and more importantly, the fact that we have the opportunity to direct those investments to the profession itself. Today is different because of the prominence of the voices of early childhood educators, and because those early childhood educators decided it was time to define who they are rather than wait for someone else to do it to them, or for them or to them. It is unprecedented because there are 15 national organizations standing together, unified for the first time in our recommendations for moving forward with a professional field of practice with agreed upon professional standards and competencies for early childhood educators, birth through age 8. To walk us through a bit how we got here, I turn it over to my friend and colleague, Lynette Fraga, the Executive Director at Child Care Aware of America.
Thank you, Rian. It was the great pleasure of Child Care Aware of America and our network of child care resource and referral agencies throughout the country to be a part of the work to ensure that all children, birth through age 8, are well served by a profession that is effective, diverse, prepared, supported, and compensated. It is time we elevate the valuable and complex roles early childhood educators play in the positive growth and development of our nation's children, regardless of where they work or how their program is funded. Our task force reflected that commitment, and for 3 years, as we gathered quarterly in NAYC's lower level, which is really the basement. The basement without windows. For those of you who are here, and for those of you who can see, we are not in a basement here. We are in beautiful DC with the sun out, many windows. Thank you, everyone, for that opportunity for us to not be in a windowless basement today for this celebration. We did take seriously our collective responsibility to honor the power of the profession and to integrate and elevate the voices of all of our members and beyond in each and every decision we made. We used many feedback loops to do this, between 6,300 survey responses, dozens of stakeholder events, 42 partner organization comments, more than 11,000 people like you have engaged in the Power to the Profession's decision cycle process. And because of the task force's extensive partners and networks throughout the country, Power to the Profession was discussed at events in 47 states and during 175 focus groups with more than 3,400 people. This included educators whose voices are often undersought and overlooked. For example, Black educators, Latinx educators, educators who speak Spanish, educators who speak other languages, and educators working in family childcare and rural communities. As you might imagine, with this kind of engagement and with this many voices at the table, the discussions were frequently spirited. Many compromises were made on the road to consensus, and this road includes bridges that span from where we are now, today, to where we know we need to be in the future. For more on that, let me turn to Matt Mayers, representing our task force colleagues at AFSCME. Thank you.
Thank you, Lynette, and thank you all who are here today in person and online. In the words of Lee Saunders, AFSCME's president, we are proud to be part of the Power to the Profession initiative to raise standards and compensation in this field that is so vital to America's future. As a union that has fought and won better pay and improved opportunities for educators currently in the field, we were grateful to be part of the community that felt strongly and clearly about the need to honor and include the existing members of the field, working across settings as we advance the profession. The Power to the Profession Task Force was and continues to be unequivocal about the need to celebrate our field's diversity, dedication, and experience. Much of this comes from the recognition that as policymakers have raised expectations and educational requirements, they have frequently done so without sufficiently attending to or funding the necessary supports and for increased compensation. This in turn has forced too many educators to leave the field or choose not to enter at all. To ensure that our recommendations do not create these kind of unintended consequences, the members of the task force are making a series of commitments to the field. Bottom line, we will not advocate for new requirements or regulations without also advocating for increased funding for supports and compensation and the establishment of realistic timelines and implementation plans. The task force is particularly mindful of the challenges faced by our current workforce, particularly those working in family childcare and other community-based settings, which is why the recommendations point specifically to the need to dismantle institutional and structural barriers that perpetuate inequalities among us. We are committed to advancing only for policies that promote the early childhood education profession by creating meaningful pathways for advancement. To be clear about where this pathway is headed, I'd like to welcome Peggy Kemp, the Executive Director of DEC, Council for Exceptional Children.
Here we go. Hello, it is, as many have said, an honor to be here, speaking on behalf of not only the task force, but the Division for Early Childhood. First of all, I want to thank Matt for his passionate piece in celebrating with all of us. At the Division for Early Childhood of the Council for Exceptional Children, we're always ready to advance a vision for our children that embraces excellence and inclusivity. As a member of the Power to the Profession Task Force, we were only too happy to support a vision in which each and every child, beginning at birth, has the opportunity to benefit from high quality, affordable, early childhood education delivered by an effective, diverse, well-prepared workforce, and most of all, well compensated. To achieve this vision, the task force was clear that we needed to build a future and build towards that future every time that we met together. separating that from what is to what would be. Each and every child, birth through age 8, across all settings, is supported by early childhood educators who've recognized early childhood degrees and credentials. In the future, early childhood educators at all professional designations, Early Childhood Educator 1, Early Childhood Educator 2, and Early Childhood Educator 3, are valued, respected, and again, well compensated for the important roles that they play. Educators with lead responsibilities across settings and age bands are prepared at the Early Childhood Educator 3 level, which means this designation earns a bachelor's degree in early childhood education at a minimum. Early childhood educators at all designations are well compensated in accordance with the complex and demanding work that they perform as part of a system that recognizes the cost of quality and finances early childhood education as the public good that it is. Further, we are committed to a vision in which anyone who wants to become an early childhood educator at any designation has equitable access to affordable, high-quality professional preparation. They also have access to development that supports them in developing the agreed-upon set of knowledge, skills, and competencies needed in any setting. To talk more about the equitable access needed by the current workforce and the challenges that they face today, I'd like to introduce Yasmina Vinci, Executive Director of the National Head Start Association.
Thank you, Peggy. And happy afternoon, everybody. Happy, beautiful afternoon. At the National Head Start Association, we're indeed very familiar with the challenges that children, families, and educators and the programs that serve them face, and also with the incredible successes that they can achieve when the circumstances are right. Yet the challenges do remain very real. As a result of the nation's failure to adequately invest in high-quality childcare and early learning, including but not limited to Head Start, children are not getting what they need. Families are paying more for childcare than for housing, if and when they can even find that care. And the workforce is paid so little that nearly half live in families that depend on public assistance and food banks. This scarcity environment has resulted in a disjointed, misunderstood, undervalued, and an inequitable field. Consider these facts. Number one, the supply is low. States are experiencing a widespread decline of licensed and regulated family childcare, for example. And while educators report multiple reasons for this decline, they frequently focus on the challenges of inadequate funding that leads to low compensation that in turn leads them to leave the field. Women of color are disproportionately impacted, for example. African American women educating children birth to 5 earn an average of $4,400 less per year than their white counterparts. Second fact is that educational requirements are low. And while many educators have been doggedly successful in their pursuit of credentials and degrees, nearly half of those working in early childhood education are working in states and settings where they are not required to meet even minimal educational qualifications. And the third, that's really the hot rail, is that consistency is low. At the same time, a hodgepodge of professional preparation programs of uneven quality are preparing early childhood educators. With approximately 1,300 associate degree programs, 1,100 bachelor's degree programs, 600 master's degree programs, and 80 doctoral degree programs, there's little alignment within and across states. So these challenges were kept front and center in our minds during the conversations at the task force, And I welcome Kirsten Hollabird from SEIU to begin to share where we landed on recommendations to address these challenges and to move the profession forward.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Yasmina. It was my great pleasure to represent SEIU, the Service Employees International Union, on the Power to the Profession Task Force and be a part of this group of individuals and organizations. The decision cycle to define the profession was one of the first things we did as a task force. And the conversation has also been the one we return to the most, woven throughout each decision cycle in nearly every discussion. It is, in many ways, the core of the power to the profession and the center of the sometimes emotional and difficult part of this journey, the answer to the question, who are we? Confronted with terms that describe those who work with children birth through grade 3, such as provider, teacher, assistant, aide, lead teacher, childcare worker, daycare worker, educator, caregiver, pre-K teacher, elementary school teacher, primary teacher, you get the gist here. The task force ultimately recommended that we define ourselves as the early childhood education profession, made up in part of those who will be called early childhood educators. The responsibilities of early childhood educators are to care for and promote the learning, development, and well-being of children birth through age 8, to establish a foundation for lifelong learning and development. Anyone has the potential to be an early childhood educator, and everyone working with and caring for young children should be valued and supported. I want to say this clearly because the task force recognized that some individuals who work directly with young children may choose to care for them without meeting the guidelines of the early childhood education profession. These individuals, who may be in small centers and/or family child care homes, will remain part of the early childhood education field, and we are committed to advocating for policies that will create accessible, equitable, and supportive pathways for them to move into the profession. As a member of a union likely to address wages, benefits, standards, and terms and conditions of unemployment for individuals in the field and the profession, we note that individuals who choose to operate outside of the profession are not the primary focus of this unifying framework. To talk more about those who will operate within the scope of the profession, I turn it over to my colleague at the NEA, the National Education Association, Sherelle Eubanks.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Kirsten. I'd also like to thank my fellow union representatives in particular, as well as all of the members of the task force. Each of us came to the table wearing the hat and representing our various audiences and stakeholders. Yet part of this journey was learning to value and appreciate the perspectives of others in service of the unified whole. Navigating through the unique aspects of each element of this workforce, including K through 3, was often challenging. We kept coming back to our shared recognition that the science of early learning is as complex for children from birth to age 3 as it is for children in preschool, as it is for children in kindergarten through 3rd grade. From a systems perspective, it's going to take an all-in effort at the state, district, and national levels, but the science cannot be ignored. It is in fact the science and the desire to reduce fragmentation which led us to recommend the structure in which the myriad of labels that have been previously mentioned and the roles of the workforce be reduced to 3 distinct and meaningful designations: Early Childhood Educator 1, ECE 1, Early Childhood Educator 2 or ECE2, and Early Childhood Educator 3, ECE3. Within the ECE1 designation, individuals must complete a preparation program that meets the minimum of 120 clock hours to earn a certificate or credential so that they can serve in support roles from birth through grade 3 settings. Individuals working within the ECE2 designation must earn an early childhood education associate's degree so that they can serve in a lead role in birth through age 5 settings and in a support role in pre-K through 3rd grade settings, such as in state and district funded pre-K programs provided in mixed delivery settings, because we must support the progression and not regression of the field. Within the ECE3 designation, as previously mentioned, individuals must earn an early childhood education bachelor's degree or initial master's degree so that they can serve in a lead role in a birth through 3rd grade setting. These professionals will be prepared to work together in various configurations as part of a teaching team. Yet each designation has an associated scope of practice, expected level of professional preparation, and expected level of mastery of the professional standards and competencies, which my colleague Kelly Baker, president of NAECTE, will now talk more about. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Sherelle. And it is truly my honor to be here today in this beautiful setting where we can actually see our nation's capital. Just to say a few words about the professional standards and competencies in early childhood education, which were revised in accordance with the recommendation of the task force and by a work group operating in parallel to the decision cycle process of Power to the Profession. And I do want to explicitly thank every member of this work group and all the educators and higher ed faculty members who came together and stayed together for challenging conversations about the unique and interconnected roles of professional preparation programs. And these standards, released today alongside the Unifying Framework, will serve as the core body of standards and competencies that establish what all early childhood educators working with children from birth to age 8 must know and be able to do. They are, for the first time ever, leveled to the 3 designations, ECE1, ECE2, and ECE3, to clearly establish the depth and breadth of the competencies required at each of these different designations. With these unified professional standards and competencies, early childhood educators will have opportunity to be recognized as knowledgeable, prepared, and safe to practice by obtaining and maintaining a professional license to practice. This license will be acquired by early childhood educators completing an accredited or recognized professional preparation program at the ECE1, 2, or 3 designation, by demonstrating evidence of field experiences, and by passing assessments of competencies. It is crucial to recognize that licensure assessments must have multiple measures, must be affordable, and must not reinforce cultural, gender, racial, or linguistic biases. The Unifying Framework establishes clearly the requirement that educators have affordable, equitable, efficient, and high-quality paths to licensure. The professional preparation of early childhood educators, however, is only one piece of a complex puzzle that must include professional compensation. And for that, please welcome my colleague, Matthew Millman, Executive Director of 0 to 3, to the stage.
Thank you, Kelly, and thank you to the other members of the task force. Dr. Fraga mentioned that we were locked in the basement of NAYC, literally on a quarterly basis for 3 years to do this report. And I have to say that it is symbolic today that we're in a room overlooking the United States Capitol, because we are coming out of the basement. We are, in fact, letting policymakers know and understand the value of this field. And for me, it was really worth the 3 years being in the basement, because I had the opportunity to see the years, birth through age 3, being embraced as an equal part of a birth to 8 continuum, and to see educators working with babies and toddlers being equally valued as well. To be clear, this value isn't merely theoretical. We believe not only in professionally preparing early childhood educators, but in professionally compensating them, like it means money, as well. And that means compensation for early childhood educators must be comparable for those with comparable qualifications, experience, and job responsibilities, regardless of where they work. Further, compensation, money, for the early childhood education profession must include an adequate benefits package, increased commensurate with increased preparation and increased competency, and not, I mean this, not be differentiated on the basis of the ages of the children served. Babies count. The task force is clear. Everyone working with early childhood in the early childhood education field should earn no less than the amount needed to cover basic living standards. Yet while there is an urgent need to increase the floor of compensation to at least a basic self-sufficiency standard, we must look as a field to the public schools as the minimum benchmark for comparable compensation, assuming comparable qualifications, experience, and job responsibilities. I want to note that the movement to raise the minimum wage is an important opportunity for some educators in some states. It can provide an impetus for states to make needed investments to increase subsidy payment rates to early childhood settings. However, the task force believes that the early childhood education, the education that is rooted in science and research, is not a minimum wage job. A self-sufficiency standard must be considered the floor and not the ceiling for early childhood educators. Now, it's true that investments in compensation will require significant increases in public dollars. Hear that over there? And that while states must increase their own spending, the federal role can and must help ensure quality, equity, and equality across all states. Now, with that, I turn this over to my colleague, Earl Franks, who I've had the pleasure to know, the baby guy, got to know, the executive director of the National Association for Elementary School Principals, and he'll talk more about the alignment between investment and accountability in the early childhood profession.
Thank you, Matthew. Matthew and I got to sit next to each other at a lot of these meetings. So it seems only right that we're presenting back to back here today. Being a member of this task force was, for me, an opportunity to both educate and be educated. Elementary school principals, like directors and other instructional and pedagogical leaders across settings, are a crucial element of and support for the early childhood education profession. While the task force focused on the early childhood educator circle of the profession within the field, we look forward to the next steps in addressing the additional recommendations that are specific to this group of leaders. We are critical in ensuring the success of early childhood educators and in understanding and supporting developmentally appropriate practice, assessment, and evaluation in the early years and grades. To that end, It's a real pleasure for me to be able to share with you today a vision for the system of shared accountability that will move this profession forward. Like Matthew said, this profession requires significantly increased investments. Yet we understand that early childhood educators can only expect these significant increases in public financing that are needed to move the profession forward if we are willing to be accountable for their effective use. At the same time, the profession can only be held accountable if it has the necessary and sufficient supports, resources, and infrastructure. Accountability is a two-way street. This is the moment for the profession itself, the whole profession, to take the lead in defining not only who early childhood educators are and what they do, but also what they will be held accountable for and what supports are needed to ensure success. As such, I'm going to turn it over to my colleagues to talk about the system supporting early childhood educators. But before I do, I'll note that early childhood educators, their allies and advocates, including parents, as well as elementary school principals, district leaders, and state superintendents, must demand increased investment from federal and state governments that are consistent with an understanding of early childhood education as a public good. Just like fourth grade or eighth grade or roads, bridges, and highways. I'm looking forward to doing my part, and with that, I'll turn it over to Valora Washington, CEO of the Council for Professional Recognition.
Representing the Council for Professional Recognition, it was a true pleasure to be involved in this historic opportunity to define the profession and create this unifying framework. As I travel across the country representing the 50,000 people who earn a Child Development Associate credential each year, it has really been a pleasure to see how much this initiative has wanted to focus on the individuals who are actually caring for and educating young children. So as all of the colleagues who've spoken today have clearly articulated, this task force recommends 3 primary professional pathways: professional certificate and credential programs, 1, early childhood associate degree programs, 2, and early childhood bachelor's degree or master's degree programs to prepare them for licensure, 3. But it's not enough for these pathways to exist. We have to structure them so that educators are offered the opportunity for unbiased, equitable, efficient means to achieve them. Educators have to be able to complete a program feeling confident that they're going to meet the competencies that help them to actually work well with young children. So in order to do this, professional preparation programs, including institutes of higher education who provide associate and bachelor's degree, have to work with state systems and others to eliminate any systemic barriers, to encourage innovation and new models and pathways that maintain the commitment to quality, that commit to earning accreditation or other kinds of recognition. Professional preparation programs are also encouraged to collaborate with professional organizations to support specializations, which early childhood educators can earn following their general foundation at each and every one of the professional designation levels. So just as professional preparation programs have to support educators, they also have to be supported in 3 key areas. The first is that we have to ensure that there are supports for students, the resources they need to provide flexible models for delivering course content. Then there need to be institutional supports, such as adequate data systems and partnerships with high-quality field experiences. And finally, there have to be supports for faculty and professional development specialists, including sufficient oversight and ratios. These are priority areas for funding, for resources and supports that are really going to help us achieve these 3 levels, 1, 2, and 3. Employers and owners also have a very important role in achieving this, and to elaborate on that conversation, I'd like to turn it over to Sage Chatel, who's from the Early Care and Education Consortium.
Thank you, Valora. I want to recognize what a milestone today is and give thanks to Celia Sims, ECEC's Policy Committee Chair, who served as our representative on the P2P task force, though she was not able to make it here today. As the voice of multi-state, multi-site providers, ECEC has a unique role and perspective on supporting the early childhood education profession. We are deeply committed, like all of our partners here, to a supported, professionalized, and compensated workforce. Like early childhood educators themselves, employers welcome accountability that reflects our input and is tied to the funding we need. To that end, ECEC embraces the opportunity to demonstrate our 3 named responsibilities in the Unifying Framework: to hire and retain early childhood educators for roles aligned to the requirements of an ECE 1, 2, and 3 designation, to provide compensation, competitive benefits packages, working conditions, and autonomy that support the well-being and effectiveness of early childhood educators, and to ensure that workplace and employee practices are aligned to the professional standards and competencies. We are compelled by a simplified, streamlined, transparent early childhood education system in which neither employees nor educators, nor parents nor policymakers are beholden to opaque and complex processes that impede our collective ability to effectively deliver on the science and promise of early learning. As employers who frequently operate across state lines, we are also committed to working with state governments to play their important roles in providing funding and setting policies to implement the recommendations in the Unifying Framework through legislative, budgetary, and regulatory mechanisms, including, for example, funding qualified preparation programs and adapting regulatory structures to support a professional workforce. Protecting the public from harm, which includes establishing and managing a state board to grant professional licenses, and finally, engaging with and being responsive to members of the profession and the public. These members, of course, include those working as multi-site employers, but also those who work as smaller owner-operators. For that conversation, please help me welcome Louis Finney, President of NAFCC, to the podium.
Thank you so much, Sage. And while I am not Louis Finney from the National Association of Family Child Care, I am extremely proud to stand before you today on behalf of the National Association of the Family Child Care, primarily because I have the privilege of acknowledging and celebrating the many leaders and staff members at NAFCC, Louis included, who contributed their expertise and perspective throughout this journey, which has opened the door to an extensive focus on early childhood educators working in family child care setting. Because educators working in family child care are and must be an equally valued part of our profession, they also require and thrive with unique supports and structures, some of which haven't even been created. Family child care is unique in part because early childhood educators working in family child care settings may see themselves and may refer to themselves as family child care operators, small business owners, or sole proprietors, even as they are simultaneously working as early childhood educators. These individuals may or may not directly employ other individuals. While the majority of the task force recommendations have been constructed to work across all settings, new and existing models will need to be developed and expanded to support the education and compensation of those who work in family child care homes. The task force vision is that regardless of where they work, early childhood educators are fairly compensated, operate with professional autonomy, and are valued and supported in their workplace. To make this system possible, it is clear that the federal government must serve as a financing backbone, though not the sole player, in order to advance a system in which every young child has access to high-quality early childhood education and care. As the system can only be provided by well-prepared, well-compensated early childhood educators, the federal government will also need to focus early childhood legislation, regulations, and funding on implementing the Unifying Framework recommendations. It must also protect and invest in early childhood education as a public good, and engage with and be responsive to members of the profession and the public. We look forward to ensuring that the voices of early childhood educators working in family child care settings are at the policy and decision-making tables, and we know we have partners in those efforts. To that end, please welcome Megan Stockhausen of the American Federation of Teachers to the stage.
Thank you, Lucy. As one of the unions on the task force, and as a part of a union that represents the early childhood educators and the faculty that prepare them, it was an absolute privilege to be a part of this work. The AFT looks forward to advocating for the recommendations in this framework. Power to the profession has centered on us, the early childhood education profession. From birth through grade 3, defining for ourselves who we are and to what we will be held accountable, as well as calling for compensation that reflects our expertise and the supports that address the barriers we face. Owning our expertise and advocacy doesn't stop with power to the profession. In looking across other professions, such as nursing, architecture, law, and accounting, one of the common features is that professions govern themselves. They, not states or the federal government, determine the guidelines for professional practice, including their expected competencies, their code of ethics, expectations for professional organization, as well as preparation, and other key aspects of professions, such as designating specializations. As such, the task force agreed, in order to stand up and sustain our profession, we need to establish a professional governance body, the PBG. The PBG will operate using 5 principles. Number 1, it must be publicly accountable and rooted in the profession. 2, equally shared power. 3, transparency. 4, lean operations. And 5, leveraging resources. The PGB will have 3 main roles: to designate professional guidelines, set parameters for quality assurance of individuals, as well as professional preparation programs, and 3, to serve as a liaison and a collaborator with state and federal agencies and regulatory bodies. A significant portion of the PGB will be comprised of individual early childhood educators, representing those who work in each setting, including family childcare, community, and school-based programs, as well as public members who do not serve on behalf of organizations. NAEYC will serve as the initial host of the PGB, providing the legal, financial, administrative, and programmatic infrastructure that will allow the PGB to operate independently, efficiently, and most importantly, with independent decision-making authority. Within the PBG's first 3 years, an outside party will conduct a comprehensive and sustainable independent review of this initial structure, including the connection to the NAEYC. With gratitude to the NAEYC and the members of the task force,
I now turn it over to my colleague Deb Murphy of Access to close our summary of the recommendations in the Unifying Framework, and with a look to what's next and a reminder as to why all of this matters so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Megan. I am honored to have been Access's representative to the task force and to have spent the last 3 years in the NAEYC basement, learning with and from my colleagues around the table and in the field. We began this journey firmly rooted in our belief that all children deserve access to high quality early childhood education, and that our early childhood educators, many of whom I have the privilege to prepare, deserve to be recognized and compensated for their skills, their knowledge, and their expertise. Power to the profession by establishing clarity about who early childhood educators are and what they will be accountable for gives all of us and our allies a fighting chance at getting the significant and sustained public investments directed towards the education and compensation of educators, which our children and families need. These investments are well worth the cost. As a member of the task force and the early childhood profession itself, and on behalf of the students that I'm teaching in just a few short hours, very few, we reject the arguments that our country does not have the money to fund equitable education and full and fair compensation. We have the resources. Paying the cost of high quality early childhood education, like paying the cost of other investments that support the nation's well-being and economic security, is a revenue generating investment over time that results in a broad range of benefits that accrue to individuals and to society at large. For every family who seeks childcare and early learning, it is time for their children to experience the benefit of having effective, diverse, well-prepared, well-compensated early childhood educators to help them thrive. I invite you, all of you, to join us in lifting up and implementing the recommendations in the Unifying Framework. As we have described, it will take all of us, practitioners, faculty, state and federal agencies and governments, philanthropists, advocates, families, employers, professional organizations, and the public to realize our vision for each and every child to have access to high quality early childhood education and educators. Thank you.
Can we take another minute to acknowledge the early childhood leadership that's standing up here? This initiative started off with 15 and we ended with 15. Must be the basement and locking of the doors, I think. So in true power to the profession fashion, we're going to open this up for questions. There are mics. There's one in the middle of the room. There are also questions coming from online, but I'm going to take the liberty for asking the first question. What do you know now about the early childhood profession that you did not know starting off? Hot potato.
Which is that what reinforced for me is sort of someone who has spent so many years focusing on babies and toddlers and how disconnected babies and toddlers were to all these systems, to see the kind of understanding and embrace from the full 15 organizations there, and that support, particularly with my good friend Earl from the K through 12 side, I think was a really, really gratifying. And to see how everyone really understood that this is about beginning with babies and building up the way that our brains are built. And that's something that we have to make sure that our policymakers know and understand.
Hello. Oh, sorry. So at SEIU, advocating for increased compensation is not a new thing. It's been the focus of our work for many years. And so I guess these years that I have been in this field and have worked with folks and have gone through lots of other initiatives where compensation wasn't necessarily a requirement as we add and do new quality initiatives, there were times when I thought, why aren't people talking about compensation? Why isn't it raised to the same level that these other things are being talked about? And I just felt like being in the room with such a varied group of people, from faculty to just the range of folks and the passion that people have to really make sure educators are compensated, was really powerful to me, and such a pleasant surprise in a way. So I'm just so happy to see that, and that was a big learning for me, and I feel like we have tons of wind in our sails now to move forward.
I think for me, it was really most exciting to see that the 15 organizations really could come together and agree. This is very complicated work. It is rocket science. It really is. And I think that one of the most important things for me is to really see how we're united in our care and concern about the people who actually do the work, the people who are working with young children every single day, and keeping them, as well as the children themselves, in the center of the conversation was very important.
One of the things that I learned in the decision cycle process and from the feedback that we received from the thousands of individual early childhood educators as well as organizations is that the field is ready to make bigger steps than we had always not believed they were ready for. Here, working on policy in Washington, D.C., we have always tried to say, let's take baby steps, let's take baby steps. And based on the feedback that we received from the field, they are ready to go. And often sort of provided feedback to us that we were moving too slow. Some of the recommendations that we were suggesting, they're already ahead of us and ready to go. So I think that we can do more than we thought that we could.
Any questions in the room?
Good afternoon. My name is Alan Gutman. I'm the Director of Early Childhood Policy and Systems at Johns Hopkins University Ideals Institute. And I first want to thank everybody for the great work and for bringing power to the profession. I have two related questions. First question is, I see there's going to be obviously a place for the state superintendents, and I know we've got some representation here today from the state school superintendents, and also for the unions in terms of looking at making sure that in collective bargaining agreements, in state systems, that there is this differentiation between early childhood educators and educators of, for example, sixth graders. While I'm credentialed to teach sixth grade in California, I'd probably be a horrible sixth grade teacher. While my degree doesn't say anything about early child, or my credential doesn't say anything about early childhood, that's where my expertise is. And I think, it's going to take some nuance to make sure that the children in early childhood getting the teachers that have been trained in early childhood. I've heard stories from when I taught in California of sixth grade teachers moving down to teach pre-K or kindergarten because they thought it was easy. And they probably learned very quickly that it's not easy or not easier than sixth grade. It just takes special expertise. And then my related question is a little concern for the structure of the ECE2 and the ECE3. I think we're still doing a little differentiation there that I don't quite understand. Like, I think we are saying that you can lead up to 4 and 5-year-olds with an associate degree, and yet we're saying when we get up to 8-year-olds, you need to have a bachelor's degree. So I think we want to be careful about what the message could be sent by that differentiation. At least that's the way I read it in the book, and I think someone else could read it that way too. We're still saying there's something more needed for older children. For me, I think there's more needed for those infants, and I think Matthew would agree with that, you know.
I think I can try to address the second question a little bit easier. I don't believe the intention of the task force was to say that older children need a more educated person. The recommendation or the distinction between ECE 2 and 3 really was representative of what exists within the public school K through 3 structure right now. And the requirements for education, licensure, et cetera, that exists now. So it is not our goal to dismantle the K-12 public school system. And so how can we work within some of the existing structures to propel the early childhood profession forward? Now, the first thing you said, what was the question?
The question is, maybe it's for the unions and for the state superintendent. What do you see as, to me, I see it as making a statement and this opportunity for us to really inform the world of K-12 to say that we are a profession and that someone who's trained to teach sixth grade is not necessarily the person that should be teaching preschool and kindergarten, that there is a difference.
Yes, there is a difference.
I want to know how the unions and the state superintendents will sort of be able to, get that message through and implement.
I just want to say something very quickly, which we had lots of conversations with at the table. So we absolutely want to make sure that kids caring for young kids are paid commensurate, if not more than school teachers now. I mean, I work with family child care providers. They make less than minimum wage. I mean, we are like down here, and we go to the bargaining table, every 2 years, and we're lucky if the state gives us, 3 cents on the very low subsidy rate already that these these educators are getting. So we absolutely need to be saying this work is the same level as K-12, but we are so far from there right now that we in the State House, when we go to get our contracts funded, people would laugh us out of the house if we ever say that to and it's just so anyway. It's really a lot of work needs to be done on that front, but we are so there with you. Just know that we want to be there, but we are working in this. We're doing lots of catch up too.
I would just say the other part of your remark about that sixth grade teacher thinking going down to pre-K that's a cinch. Wait to see about what you do with babies if you really know what you're doing. And I think that part of what the statement here is that the science is so clear that what we do with babies and toddlers, what we do with preschoolers is equally, if not more important when you really look at what is happening developmentally in the early brain development, in terms of early personality development. Those are the critical years, and we need to have people who are well compensated and well trained to be able to be in those positions. And any sixth grade teacher that thinks that would be a cinch, they need to go back to school.
So I might respond to the same issue as my friend and colleague Matthew. When you talk about the sixth grade teacher moving down to pre-K or kindergarten, or even, frankly, first, second, or third grade, I think what you're getting at is less about a superintendent's decision and more about state licensure decisions. So superintendents, in my understanding, don't really have control over that. So I think because we have now a unifying framework, we are in a much better position to advocate state by state and make it very clear as we own our profession that if you are teaching pre-K, kindergarten, first, second, or third, or, and that happens to be my emphasis, but or teaching and caring for infants and toddlers, we require, our profession requires that you have a license to practice. And so I think we are a step closer to that just because of what's coming out today. That's my hope.
At the AFT, really being a part of this task force, our focus is on lifting up those working with children from infancy through grade 3. In no way do we want to malign or undercut the work that educators who are doing in higher grades, or educators who, you know, maybe they are a third grade teacher or fourth grade teacher, but they're filling a vacancy in preschool and they're doing the best they can. This is about lifting up all educators and making sure that families and children have high quality early childhood education and care, and that those providing high quality early childhood education and care have the resources and the supports they need to do their jobs.
So to address the second part of the question, I think it would do us well to end sort of this conversation with what we call an audacious vision. And really it is that eventually that all of the early childhood educators will have a bachelor's degree. And so again, as our colleagues have said, there are realities that we allowed for and thought about, but definitely the future is where we're headed.
And I'd like to add that what your question highlights for me is whether someone has a child development associate credential, an associate degree, or a bachelor's degree. The critical element is that they have the competencies to perform the role for which they are hired. Because as we know, regardless of one's degree, as you indicated with your sixth grade credential, you have to be competent. And I think that one of our aims is to establish as part of this framework what those competencies might be and how we really, regardless of people's degree or credential, that they have those competencies, they can demonstrate their skill, their knowledge, their ability to perform working with children. So a degree, a credential of any kind is in some ways a proxy for competence, but I think what we've tried to do in this framework is to be very explicit about the competencies, because it is competency that is at the core of what we're wanting to achieve with our children.
It's okay. To follow up on Valora's comments, I think certainly the framework is a starting point to the competency piece. And as a principal for 9 years, I never had a sixth grade teacher come to me and say they wanted to teach kindergarten because it was easier.
Or deal with babies because the pay was a lot less.
We can take another question from the floor.
Hi, good afternoon. I am Dr. Rosalina Burgos. I am the Senior Director of Early Childhood Programs at Centronia. I come from Puerto Rico. I was a professor in the teacher preparation program at the University of Puerto Rico, where I started my journey as an early childhood educator. And today I've been tweeting about the pride and the celebration for me, because when I started my studies 30 years ago, my father told me that's an utopia that doesn't exist. And I kept telling him that it would, that it could. It only took 30 years. But I'm really happy, and I want to commend you on the job, because this is something that when I started my bachelor degree and I decided that I wanted to be a college professor, knowing that I had a long path in front of me, I knew that this is one of the biggest barriers, the recognition of who we are. I am a doctor, but I'm first an early childhood educator. And teachers and people think that I still care for children, but I do, indirectly, but that's my job. And I'm really proud of the job you have done. It was needed. And I wanted to share this anecdote of my work with Centronia. We had the Department of Labor come in to investigate a complaint and the designation of exempt or non-exempt employees in my early childhood staff. And regardless of the 10-page description of the jobs that I gave to them, they considered that my infant and toddlers teachers, the only thing they do is change diapers and feed babies, that they agreed to consider my pre-K teachers professionals because they have BAs, and that for them, no matter how much I kept giving them research, I really bothered them a lot, research and stuff, they couldn't believe that early childhood centers are run with people they don't consider professionals. So I hope that this starts there, in a place where they define who is a professional or not, and who decides a lot of policies that have to do with their work and wages and compensation and everything. Because it was really frustrating and very, very, very depressing for me. So I am really glad. I really commend you on this job, and I'm really happy that I'm still alive to see this. So.
Well, can I say on behalf of all of us, not only are we happy that you're alive to see it, but it ain't going to be 30 years before we get to where we need to go. Okay? And the way that happens is by all of us being organized and making sure that the people over our shoulder hear that, and the Department of Labor down the street gets it and understands it. And that's all our collective job to do, is to help them to understand the critical importance of these early years.
So I'm Robert Gunling, and I have the honor of serving as the president of the board of directors of the DC Association for the Education of Young Children. So first and foremost, on behalf of our over 800 members, I want to thank you for your service. As I listen to you talking and look and speak to the Capitol, for us, we're really reminded that Washington, D.C. is made up of neighborhoods. And in those neighborhoods are young children and early childhood teachers. And so often we're seen in the shadow of the nation's government. In addition, I want to acknowledge that in Washington, D.C., we are celebrating our 10th year of universal pre-K, where all 3- and 4-year-olds have access to high-quality early childhood programs. And our system includes all 3 sectors of education. And then finally, extremely proud that in 2018, our City Council unanimously passed the Birth to 3 Act, which will make us the first jurisdiction in this country to have universal early childhood education for all children from birth to 8 years old. And my question is, now as we grapple with this law in collaboration with our government officials, that this work it looks easy, but it's highly complex. So I'm curious, today we celebrate the work of the task force, what your thoughts are as far as what you believe the journey will look like, the timeline until we get there, and what's a realistic first step so that we can convey to our 800 members that today really is a defining moment and not simply a ceremony where we celebrate where we are today. Thank you.
Thanks, Robert. Just briefly, we wanted to spend the most of today on the report and the recommendations. But in terms of moving forward, I think there are a few key things. First is we don't want to leave this up to states to have to figure out on their own and decipher what is. So our intent is to draft model legislation, regulatory licensing language that we know will be unique in some ways in states, but at least it gives states a roadmap for what the intent of these recommendations are. Because we're concerned if we don't do that, that states will interpret in different ways and we'll end up in the same boat that we're in right now. And so it will take advocates on the ground like you all to ensure that recommendations are moving forward. We have been doing a lot of work, outreach with states to see if there are governors and early childhood system leaders who are willing to be early adopter states. I think there's a lot of consensus here that particularly given the increased investments in CCDBG, that the first thing we have to tackle is compensation. We made a commitment, and if we don't have some early good, strong wins in compensation, then we have made a commitment that we're not going to increase any kind of competency requirements without that. So that will be really important. And then the professional governance body that Megan talked about will be really important because we did punt on a few things. As detailed as these recommendations are, it does leave some questions around grandfathering policies, around kind of, again, the bridging of where we are to where we want to be, how you do that. And so this semi-independent body that can look to getting into those weeds in a way that we didn't will also be really important.
I just want to add something about process, because part of what Rian described is sort of a framework around next steps. But just as we know what we do with children and families is all about relationships, so too will be the work you're going to be doing in communities and states. And so we, as I shared earlier, we had a lot of sensitive conversations, a lot of challenging conversations, getting comfortable with being uncomfortable. Making sure you have the right people at the table or individuals at the table that you would not have considered before. We're all on this journey together. And I think part of what was helpful for us in the last few years is to really have a framework for how it was that we were going to be together and to walk in the door committed to a healthy outcome on behalf of children, which we could all rally around. And I think that was really, really critical to get us through the difficult discussions.
I'll actually include a question from an online participant for the higher ed faculty. What are the next steps for higher ed? If I was a higher ed faculty, what would be the next steps?
So I think in terms of where we are in higher ed, we're a reflection of the early childhood profession as a whole. And by that, I mean that there are very different pathways state to state. So I think the next steps for higher ed, for one, we're going to look very closely at the PGB and the specific recommendations for us in higher ed. But as a beginning, higher ed folks are going to be about the business of making sure that we have systems in place, both state by state and through our national association, that would very clearly lay out pathways, articulation agreements, that it would be very visible and evident what a candidate would need to do to get the credentials that person would desire. Again, part of what happens in higher ed is that many of the barriers that have been discussed are still systemic barriers. And so there's going to be a lot of advocacy toward removing bias that does occur in systems of higher ed and making each credential more easily accessed by any who wants to become either an ECE 1, 2, or 3.
Thank you. Again, can you thank the members of the task force for leading this? We will now transition and turn it over to Felicia Dehaney, who's going to walk us through how to do this work with our equity lens tightened.
Thank you again. I want to make sure, do you guys hear the echo? Or is it just me? Okay. I just want to again thank the Power to the Profession Task Force and Marika Cox Mitchell for facilitating this great conversation. Just some quick thoughts from today. This was a great discussion and I'm really excited. But some quick captures. The first one was many said today would be impossible. Children are why we are here today. It's my life's work. Connectivity and quality, increased investments. The science cannot be ignored, science and promise. Often overthought and underlooked. Never lose sight of the facts. It will take us all. Support the profession, not the regression. Protect from harm. Equitable and achievable pathways. A public good. Alignment front and center. Public supports. Put a stake in the ground about who ECE professionals are. An army of early childhood educators. Acknowledge and separate. Recognition for all. Educate and be educated. Accountability is a two-way street. Over 1,000 voices. Okay is not okay. Economic security. Protect the racial diversity of the workforce. Equally shared power. Preparation, compensation, and benefits. Ready states, ready policy. Transforming the workforce. This is just the beginning. Dismantle structural barriers and inequalities. Birth to a continuum of high standards. We're coming out the basement. The field is ready to go. Wind in our sails. 15 national organizations came together and stayed together, committed and unified. Thank you to everyone today who spoke. Though I'm sorry I can't be with you all in person, it's my great honor to be speaking to you as an individual, a former teacher, a mother of a 3-year-old son, currently in an early childhood education program as we speak, every day so I can work, an organizational supporter and funder of the Power to Profession. Today is a great day, right? Like everyone else, I'm so excited to celebrate the release of the long-awaited Unifying Framework for the early childhood education profession. But the fact that the Unifying Framework is here is not why I think today is great. I think today is great because of the process it took to get here and because of what that process says about the work to come. For those of you who know me, you know I've never been one to shy away from a tough conversation. And this process has led to many tough conversations in ways that challenged each of us who participated. There weren't and aren't always easy answers. Armed with data, research, experience, and passion, sometimes driving in different directions, the task force, stakeholders, funders, and the field had to grapple with some difficult proposals, difficult decisions. So thank you all for your grace as we all challenged each other and we got it done. In many ways, this process is similar to those of us at the Kellogg Foundation. That is what we do every day. And it's not just in terms of determining which organizations get funded and why. It's because of the pursuit of equity, the heart of our foundation's DNA and this initiative. It is not smooth or easy. It demands discomfort. It requires us to face our own biases and ask others to confront theirs too. But it is incumbent for us to do this. And it's for the good of the field, for the children, the families we serve, and the communities we live in, to have difficult conversations about what equity means and how we work towards it. And it's even better for our field to have these difficult conversations, but not let them divide us. Unity is a choice. It is a choice that the members of the task force made time and time again, even when it would have been easier to choose otherwise or even walk away. It's a choice educators make time and time again when they put their disagreements aside and find ways to share the same message before their state legislators in pursuit of needed investments. And it's why today is a great day. And it's why I'm hopeful for the work ahead. If we continue to elevate the voices of the field, if we continue to prioritize the pursuit of equity, if we continue to choose unity, we will advance the early childhood and education profession together. I want to say a big thank you to everyone involved, our fellow foundation partners who supported this work, the task force for their commitment, and to the early childhood educators whose voice led the way. Thank you, and today is a great day. Now, let's take a minute to hear from the voices in the field. Thank you all.
I'm in.
I'm in.
I'm in.
I'm in.
I'm in for the Unifying Framework for the Early Childhood Education Profession.
The Unifying Framework is the result of Power to the Profession, a multi-year, profession-led initiative to define the early childhood education profession.
It sets the vision that each and every child,
beginning at birth,
has the opportunity to benefit from high-quality early childhood education, delivered by an effective, diverse,
well-prepared,
and well-compensated workforce across all states and settings.
For too long, early childhood educators have not had the recognition or investments they need to best serve children and families.
And this lack of investment
has led to an underprepared,
under-resourced, and inequitable workforce. We can't keep meeting higher quality standards
and completing degrees
while still earning poverty.
It's time for change.
It's time for change.
It's time for change.
It's time for change.
So 15 of our national organizations came together.
And with extensive
more than 11,000 early childhood educators.
In higher education faculty like me,
reached consensus on some core recommendations
to advance our early childhood education profession. And I'm in. I am excited to have a unified framework to advocate for compensation
based on our complex, skilled, and valuable work.
I'm ready to be part of a profession that embraces the science of early learning
and the importance of developmentally appropriate practice.
As a faculty member, I can tell you we need this kind of clarity and consistency about the competencies and skills our graduates need to best support children and families. As someone working in state systems, I can tell you we need this too.
We can do this.
We can do this.
Lo podemos lograr.
We can do this.
Let's build the bridge together
toward the unified early childhood education profession.
All of us need.
All of us need.
All of us need.
I'm in.
We're in. Estoy en apoyo.
We're in.
Off the stage. You want a picture? Just come on down.
Hogan, the Managing Director for Policy and Professional Advancement at NAUIC. And I have to start by saying that I love the joy that everyone brought to that video. I may never get over Kia Steen literally shouting her enthusiasm about how something has to change, and she's all in. I'm feeling very inspired by their commitment and belief in this work, and I think it's that commitment that will sustain us in the months and years ahead. What you've heard about the challenges the task force and the field faced in getting to where we are today, there's many more that await us ahead. But it is my great pleasure to spend just a few minutes today, some of the questions that came up about what's next for higher ed, about what's next for the field, to talk with you not just about those challenges, but about the opportunities, about the work underway, and about where we go from here. As you've seen and heard throughout the day today, the Unifying Framework lays out an ambitious and exciting agenda for creating the defined, diverse, equitable, well-prepared, and well-compensated early childhood education profession. And though the document is complex and detailed, its aim is actually to simplify and clarify. Some of the framework's audaciousness is merely in the envisioning of a world in which the answer to any question about our workforce, where do you work, what do you earn, how do you become one, isn't, well, it depends. Our field has been crying out for consistency and cohesion and compensation, particularly regarding expectations and supports for early childhood educators within and across states and settings. We want families, students, and policymakers to understand who an early childhood educator is, what she does, regardless of where she does it, and why she should be compensated in accordance with her skills and competencies. The intention of the task force was never to layer the recommendations of the Unifying Framework on top of existing state and federal systems. Though many of those were built in response to some of the same challenges we're still grappling with today, we have to confront the reality that some of these systems need unwinding and reorienting in order to free up the funding and focus that can be directed toward the element that makes the biggest difference in driving access to quality, and that's the people of the profession. As you heard from Marika earlier today, it often takes decades to align and finance a profession across states and settings. Fortunately, however, this isn't work that has to happen in a silo. It's not like we aim to have folks working on like higher education access over here and childcare subsidies over there and preschool development grants somewhere back over there, and then now they have to add in power to the profession somewhere. No. It's all connected, and it's already happening, and it wouldn't have happened without all of you. So let's start with the fact that funding is increasing for childcare and early learning. From $1.1 billion in additional funding in the last federal funding deal, to states who are putting dollars into childcare and pre-K, to ballot initiatives that are passing at the local levels, to philanthropies expanding commitments, to campaign promises at all levels and from all parties around the need to address the childcare crisis, there is a moment afoot. It is a moment full of promise, and it's incumbent upon us to seize this moment to ensure that the funding on the table is directed towards the education and compensation of the profession. Now that we know, through the Unifying Framework, who they are, what competencies they need, and what they're being compensated for. So let's turn to the education of this profession. From Alabama to Wyoming, and actually it's not just those are the first and last states alphabetically. There's actually really great work happening in Alabama and Wyoming on this front. There's exciting work happening to reshape the early childhood professional learning continuum and align it to the professional standards and competencies so that there's a cohesive system that leads to greater degree attainment and a more effective early childhood workforce. Here's a list of just some of the things that states are doing already. Adopting the ECE 1, 2, and 3 designations, creating a new bachelor's degree in early childhood education that'll include stackable credentials aligned to the professional standards and competencies, requiring statewide articulation from associate's to bachelor's degrees, supporting early childhood education degree programs and seeking accreditation in order to ensure quality and alignment with competencies, identifying quality field experience locations across settings, expanding degree-based registered ECE apprenticeship programs, providing funding and support, including comprehensive scholarships to current and prospective early childhood educators working in all settings, creating access to ECE coursework in languages other than English, and creating higher education consortia to build articulation agreements, address course content gaps, and make the professional prep professional preparation pathways clear. There's so many steps that a higher education system, that a state system can take to move these efforts to the next level. And each of you should be able to see yourselves and your state in this work, either in what you're already doing or in what you could be doing. And yet this work, if it stands alone, will not be enough. Last year, NAIC partnered with the Education Trust to research and release a paper called Increasing Qualifications, Centering Equity, Experiences and Advice from Early Childhood Educators of Color, which asked primarily Black educators in 3 states for their reflections and guidance on how policies should be structured to reach non-traditional students, which, let's be honest, that's really just our whole field, eliminate existing barriers, maintain a commitment to quality, and advance equity. Their words and guidance are crucial as we move forward with both proven strategies that we can deploy and innovative efforts that, frankly, we need to invent. But the key that they talked about is that no matter how much increased access people are able to achieve to higher ed, if they still remain uncompensated at the end, we will not have done what we need to do to build supply, increase quality, retain excellent educators who can deliver on the science of early learning. Folks have gotten tired, I think, of standing at the back of the room shouting about compensation. And finally, the states, businesses are listening to what they need to do. Here's a list of just some of the things that states and the federal government are implementing, exploring, or working towards already when it comes to compensation. Increasing childcare subsidy payment rates, working on increasing compensation related to, as they raise those rates, how do we make sure that funding goes to the compensation of the workforce? Providing grants and loan forgiveness, especially for early childhood educators across settings. Providing access to state public benefits, such as paid sick leave for educators working in family childcare. Requiring starting salary parity with elementary school teachers for pre-K teachers in both public and private program settings. Embedding the ECE workforce efforts in larger statewide goals and other funding streams. Creating wage and career ladders. Providing wage supplements and tax credits that are tied to increasing qualifications. And introducing legislation that makes significant investments in career pathways and supports for early childhood educators. Everyone can and must work together to be able to continue to put compensation front and center. Let me just add that if you don't feel like you're getting enough implementation conversations today, then I have good news for you. First, if you haven't had enough of the tough conversations Felicia talked about, our friends at New America are hosting a conversation tomorrow on moving beyond false choices for early childhood educators, now online, at which they will be elevating diverse perspectives on the most challenging issues facing the early childhood field. And second, as Rhian talked about, we're going to be working all day, every day, over the coming weeks, months, and years to implement the recommendations from the Unifying Framework. Y'all should see the task force faces. They're like, what about now? All day, every day. I'm not going back to that basement. In partnership with the educators, faculty, state systems leaders, communities, states, with resources and strategies and toolkits and templates and model legislation and more. But if you are a chief state school officer, there are crucial roles for you. And if you're a superintendent or a state legislator, a governor, a policy advisor, a child care administrator, a college dean, a member of Congress, there are crucial roles for everybody in moving towards implementation. Nearly every day now, we wake up to new calls and emails from states and cities and institutions of higher education and individual educators who want to talk about what they're doing and make sure it's in alignment with the Unifying Framework. They believe in this work, and we believe in them and in our collective power to make it happen. And with that, please join me in welcoming Maria Isabel Balivan, Executive Director of the ACA Child Development Center, to the stage.
This is nerve-wracking. I am not always, well, as being an early childhood education, in the early childhood education field, I'm always more in the shadows and behind the scenes. And being here is just very emotional to me. I don't know why I was chosen to be here today, but I want to thank everybody here. And I want to start by thanking Lauren, because it's just wonderful to hear that states, communities, and higher education institutions are moving forward to advance our profession. They're not alone, since early childhood educators across the country are celebrating the fact that finally we're gaining the recognition for the work we do. We are so ready. Today is the first time that early childhood educators have access to the tools, the time, and the opportunities needed to play an important role in shaping the future of our profession. We're stepping into the moment knowing that our voices are needed. We are becoming ever stronger advocates for ourselves, for each other, and for the children and families that we serve. Let me give you an example. Since 2010, I have been working as the executive director for the ACA Child Development Center in Annandale, Virginia. We serve nearly 300 children every year, from birth through age 5. Our center has 60 amazing early childhood educators who are dedicating to themselves to make sure that children have the very best start in life. They agree that the only way to achieve this important goal is by delivering high-quality early care and education. You know that delivering high-quality care and education is easier said than done, right? It doesn't come for free. It's not something we can grasp from the tree and just make it happen. As such, they know that their own professional development is key in improving the outcomes of the children they are educating. In fact, at ACA, we have managed to create a community of learners, where every year each teacher receives more than 100 hours of in-house training. Since 2016, my early childhood educators have enrolled in an initiative launched by the Virginia Department of Labor to obtain an apprenticeship certificate that puts them in the path toward associate and bachelor's degrees. Without questions, they are seizing the opportunities and advancing their careers. Moreover, they're also becoming loud voices, advancing, becoming better advocates, and guiding policies and investment and impacting positively the lives of children and the families in our communities. Educators everywhere are waking up to the power they have to speak up, speak out, and be at the tables where decisions are being made. Together, we're all becoming a true force of nature that seeks to improve and advance early childhood education profession. But the responsibility for advocacy and engagement cannot only be on the shoulders of these educators. There are things that leaders, policymakers can do and must do in order for it to make it possible for educators to be effectively engaged and successful advocates. Let me give you another example. Virginia has recently embarked in a $95 million mission to improve early childhood education and has been extremely intentional in their effort to reach out to educators and the families for young children. Virginia's First Lady, Pamela Northam, and the Virginia Early Childhood Foundation have gone out of their way to ensure that policy decisions are relevant, effective, and meaningful. During this process, I have encouraged and accompanied teachers and parents to make their voices be heard. I have brought people like Nicole Lazarte and Summer Mejia down to Richmond to talk about their work and to share the first experience that they have and the challenges that I have in meeting this mission. This is why I also make certain that these early childhood educators also attend community meetings, testify in front of the Fairfax County Board of Supervisors, and make the trip down to Virginia every so often to lobby state senators and delegates. I have also heard stories about educators working in family care settings, offering video testimony because they couldn't leave their home during the day, but didn't want to miss the chance to speak out on legislation that matters to them. And I know of coalitions that have provided funding for stipends and substitutes in order for teachers to participate in meetings. I myself was benefiting from that in my visit to Milwaukee not long ago. It is about prioritizing time and funding to ensure that educators have the supports they need to contribute their experience and expertise. And it is worth expending the time and the money to have those contributions, because they will make policy and financing decisions better and more effective. Rooted in what early childhood educators know will make a difference for them and the children and the families they serve. There are 2 million early childhood educators in this country. We have not even begun to tap into the power of our profession, but we can. The unified vision that was presented today is an amazing thing. I know I am joined by many in gratitude to the organizations and individuals who led their time, effort, and expertise in the basement of NAEYC to see it through. It is going to be so important for us to continue to lead with this unity, to bring even more voices in, and to keep fighting together in the time ahead. So to each of you who are out there listening today, please know how important your voices are. Please use them. Please reach out to each other and to parents and families as partners in the fight for investments in high-quality early childhood education that make it affordable for them with compensation for you. And for all of the directors, employers, principals, superintendents, and other administrators out there, please know there is so much you can do starting today to partner with educators and to elevate their voices in your communities. To my fellow educators, let's be the advocates children and families need us to be. We are here with you. We're all here for you. Let's show everybody what it means when we demonstrate the power of this profession. I want to close out with a quote from Mr. Roger. You know him? He once said, where it is. He once said, "We live in a world in which we need to share responsibility. It's easy to say, it's not my child, not my community, not my world, not my problem. Then there are those who see the need and respond. I consider those people my heroes. You are the heroes of today, and you are the hope for tomorrow. Thank you so very much for making this possible."
And now playing the part of Karen Ponder will be Amy O'Leary, Chair of the NAEYC Governing Board. I want to share the remarks that Karen didn't get a chance to share earlier today. If you leave with one message, leave with this. We can do this. We can build the bridge from where we are now towards a unified early childhood education profession for the future. It has been an extraordinary honor to be part of this bridge-breaking team and to serve as chair for the Power to the Profession Task Force. So can we give it up for Karen? And before we end, Karen wanted to make sure we thank the people and organizations who helped and support the Unifying Framework. She wants to express her gratitude for the facilitation of Leslie Anderson, as well as the participation of several task force members who represented their organizations at various points in the process, and staff members from all the task force organizations who provided key insights and counsel. Karen specifically wants to thank several of NAEYC's key staff members who provided guidance and leadership and their support, including Marika Koch-Mitchell, of course, during her time at NAEYC, and Lauren Hogan, Catherine Kempt, Mary Harrell, Barbara Willer, Nancy Griswold, and Lucy Riccio. Can we please thank them as well? Our gratitude extends to the many stakeholder organizations, too many to name today, as well as the foundations whose supports, concerns, and challenges to the task force have served to improve our collective work, namely the Foundation for Child Development, the Alliance for Early Success, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, Richard W. Goldman Family Foundation, the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, and the W. Clement and Jesse V. Stone Foundation for their immensely valued and valuable support and engagement. And finally, Karen wants to thank each and every member of the task force and of this field for their service and for joining together on this incredible and important journey with children always at the center. Thank you.
I think there's food, right? There's food and drink.
Yes, there's a reception. We can go to right outside. Thank you, everybody.